everyone. Welcome to the 334th episode of the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and your co-host,
Kevin Toffel.
And we have a really in-depth security show for you today.
And not the good kind.
No, it's never the good kind. So we are actually going to be issuing a correction for y'all. We're also going to be talking about an update to SmartThings that I think makes it look a little bit more like Home Assistant. We're also going to be talking about multiple security flaws since DEF CON was last week. And yeah, just a bunch. The Industrial Internet Consortium has changed its name. We're going to talk about what the new name is and why. Plus, Google's Fuchsia is actually out in the world, and we've got a new IoT satellite network to talk about. We're also going to hear from our guest this week, Vanya Samuelson, who is the CEO of Koitech. And this is part of a little theme we've had for the last week and this week, which is about building lower energy consuming devices. So she's going to be talking about how to evaluate power consumption throughout the development process. And we're also going to hear from our sponsor, Very. Before we get into it, let's hear from Very. Are you looking for an IoT development firm that has, done a lot of things? Very has an award-winning team of senior engineers, designers, they have data scientists who are all going to work with you to get your biggest IoT hardware and software products fully operational. You can learn more at www.verypossible.com and feel free to tell them you heard about them on the show. Alrighty. Let's get to it. First up, we have to start with the correction. Last week, we talked about Helium getting $111 million from Andreessen Horowitz. I have the hardest time saying that name, but they didn't. What happened was Helium, which is the low power wide area network that, has miners and tokens, and we've talked about it before. The venture fund actually bought 111 million HNT, so the Helium network tokens. That money didn't go to Helium. That money was just to prop up the market for HNTs.
I mean, it's an investment. It's just a different kind of investment.
So they're saying they believe in the people-powered network. Y'all should also be aware that I'm talking to Frank Mong, who is what is he over there? I think he's the COO at Helium, and he and I are going to be talking about the 5G network. So stay tuned or look forward to that. And I think it's going to be in the newsletter. So,
are you going to tell them that you're upset with your neighbor?
Oh, yes, I am. So I think I told y'all I run a miner that I have for years because I'm such a goof and I'm so excited about being part of a people-powered, low-powered, wide area network. I'm also part of Amazon Sidewalk. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, so I had made like $15,000 on this network. And then my neighbor came in and put their own hotspot in, which is good, except for it's right next to mine. So now we're basically splitting coverage. And what it did is instead of every time I transmit a data packet or someone witnesses my hotspot to provide proof of coverage, instead of getting 1 times the value of that, now I'm getting 0.21 times the value of that. And I'm really sad because
I probably shouldn't tell you that I reached out to your neighbor and I gave them a hotspot.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, oh man, but it's sad for my neighbor too, because they're like, they're probably looking at me and I'm like, I was here first.
I mean, there's an easy resolution. I mean, that would actually be good for everybody since it's the people's network. Your neighbor should just move further away and expand the network coverage.
They measure this by hexagons, basically somewhere within 0.4 kilometers of me. 0.4 square kilometers is my neighbor's hotspot.
And she will find them.
Instead of going around like a psychopath knocking on doors asking, I think I'm just going to be like, maybe find another neighbor and run the hotspot at their house. So we'll see. Otherwise, this can happen. This too could happen to you. Mm-hmm. All right. That's the Helium update / correction. Let's talk about SmartThings. I think it was my Wemo was my first IoT purchase, but soon afterwards, I backed the SmartThings platform on Kickstarter, and I had run a SmartThings device, a hub, since like 2013.
It wasn't even SmartThings then, was it? Wasn't it Quirky?
No. That's a completely different device. Remember how we used to have all those hubs, the Revolve, the Wink, No, SmartThings was always SmartThings. It didn't get bought by Samsung until 2014, though. Anyway, so it was about summer of last year that SmartThings said they were going to transition off the Groovy language. They were going to kill a bunch of their features and that they were not going to make hardware anymore. And that was a big announcement. And it was part of kind of this whole refresh that's happening around SmartThings. So now SmartThings is coming out and saying they're doing something called SmartThings Edge. And really essentially what this is you can run local device handlers. Developers can write them themselves. They can run them all locally on their hardware.
So that's good because it takes the cloud out of play right off the bat, which was an early issue with the SmartThings hardware, which always needed internet connectivity. You don't even need internet connectivity for SmartThings Edge applets, I'll call them, or device handlers to run. So that's a good thing. They're moving away from Groovy, as you said, which was their language used for device handlers. They're moving to Lua, which means moon in Portuguese, by the way. Well, it was developed over either in Brazil or Portugal, I forget which, back in the mid-90s. And so what this means is, you're right, developers can create their own device handlers. And that's a very good thing, because that was one of the big questions we had when Samsung said they were making these major changes. So people will be happy because there will be custom device handlers. The downside is Samsung isn't writing them. Samsung is basically giving people probably an SDK for SmartThings Edge and language support with Lua to create these, but they're not creating them. So that's very interesting because, as you said at the top of the show, this reminds you more of, say, a home assistant or a home bridge type approach where communities develop these and share them and so on. And that's kind of interesting that Samsung is basically relying on its customers to create the value here.
Well, yes, and I'll give you credit. You actually were like, "Hey, this reminds me of that." So I'm not going to steal your credit there. But, and I should also tell people, look, SmartThings is still going to support the cloud to cloud stuff. If you want to have, like, if you have a device that is like Hue lights, those are classic cloud connected devices, right? There's a link to the back to the Hue cloud. What will happen is those will still work, unless, power outage, that sort of things. And if you're doing routines and you build routines with things that have a mix of local control and cloud control, you'll get like a little icon that's like, hey, by the way, this is going to be cloud controlled. Eventually, SmartThings wants the local stuff to still happen, and the cloud stuff just won't happen because it's obviously in the cloud and you might not be connected if your internet goes out. I mean, this is a good thing. I think a lot of people who are hardcore SmartThings users are going to like it. I actually think it's good for kind of the middle of the road, not the super hardcore, but maybe people like me who like to play with this and aren't too shy about finding a device handler. I was a little concerned because I asked SmartThings, how are you going to handle things like security with something like this? And it sounds, instead of like developers having to meet a SmartThings profile or threshold around security, it sounds like SmartThings is going to be looking out for bad device handlers and stopping them after the fact. And I get it. I mean, especially if you're dealing with people who are building their own very bespoke device handlers and routines and sharing it.
I agree with you. I think people who don't mind tinkering with code a little bit might enjoy, pushing outside their comfort zone here, because Lua it's a very lightweight language. It's small. It's very quick. It's, I would say, C or Python-like. So it's a very scriptable language. And, I could see people, tinkering around and trying to add support. And in terms of support, I just wanted to mention that Samsung said that you'll be able to connect to Zigbee, Z-Wave, and LAN-based integrations and more protocols in the future, including Matter. So it's nice to see they're thinking ahead. And if you're wondering and waiting for Matter and you're not sure who's going to adapt it, this is another positive sign.
Yes, and that is a good thing. And I think ultimately, and this will also run on V2 and V3 SmartThings hubs. You already know that your V1 hub and I think an ADT hub aren't working. The reason is they couldn't support this particular effort through those devices. They didn't have enough computing power on them. And I hear, although I don't see it, that Aotech, who is the company that makes the newer SmartThings hub, will have stock soon. The chip shortage has really hurt the hub guys. It really has. Okay, so that's the update on SmartThings. Are y'all ready for some security talk?
Buckle up.
Yeah! All right. Let's start in with the chip designer Realtek. They said that they have 4 security vulnerabilities in 3 of their SDKs that affect Wi-Fi. These Wi-Fi modules that they've built, they're used in almost 200 IoT devices, and they basically allow someone to fully compromise the target device and execute whatever code they want. They're mostly buffer overflow vulnerabilities.
So Realtek does have patched SDKs for these issues, which apparently have been around for like 10 years, but it's going to be up to the different device makers themselves to implement whatever changes need to be made. And just to give you an idea, the manufacturers that are affected include some of the bigger names such as ASUS, Belkin, Buffalo, D-Link, Huawei, LG, Logitech, Netgear. So I would see if you own devices from any of those vendors, especially if they're older devices, I would go check support forums and pages for them.
And I would say most of those vendors are very proactive about issuing patches. So fingers crossed.
Agreed.
There's another vulnerability that can't be patched, and this one is a whopper, and it's complicated.
Yeah, and it's funny because we're going to be talking about this in some of my upcoming classes, and that's random number generation, which you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with anything? But a lot of passphrases, hashes, and such rely on a random number, either software-based or hardware-based, to generate, unique
keys. Yeah, so you can encrypt things.
Yeah. So there's a couple issues. As I said, you can have software-based random number generators and hardware-based random number generators. And the software ones are pretty much seeded programmatically in a sense. So I've literally seen the same random numbers generated when using a random number function in my own code. They're not as random as one would think. So a lot of companies go with hardware random number generators. And instead of having a particular seed number to start with, they use some input from a sensor, for example, like what's the temperature right now? That's going to be my random number seed. And here's your random number with that seed. That changes much more often. It's much more random, if that makes sense. And apparently
it's not random enough.
Well, there's that problem and also a potential error, because if the hardware random number generator doesn't have enough inputs to gather random seed data, it can be exploited and actually return an error. So you don't get a random number at all. And that's not handled well by a lot of devices. So there's a problem here and it's very difficult to resolve.
So the idea here is, if you're pulling sensor data, like the temperature is a good one. So you start from there. But if you pull the temperature, a lot of these, when generating, they actually have to generate a lot of new seeds very quickly, but the temperature doesn't change very quickly. So you're starting for the same place, and then that nets out an error. So the bottom line for people, because this is pretty esoteric, but the bottom line is your IoT devices may not actually be accurately encrypting your data. And from an exploit perspective, because this is freaky, but I'm also like, who's able to really exploit this? How complicated is this? And the answer is, it would be hard to exploit it, but you could figure it out and then offer that on the open market.
No reason to panic right now, but you should be aware of this, in my opinion.
And it's not something that can be patched. This is a hardware level issue. You may see, I guess, software updates that do this, but
there could be software updates because, if you're generating, say, a 128-bit random number, you could then use just a slice of that and pull, say, 32 digits out of it at a random start and end point. You could add more randomness to it, but it's going to take some code changes.
Yeah. And basically, the answer is having a different level of seed generation here. And it's something you have to build in from the get-go. So, I wouldn't freak out utterly. This is a good thing for people to know about if you're building IoT devices, because it's going to change the way you develop them. And it's also it's good for companies like the chip manufacturers, who I'm sure also are aware of this, and how they're going to have to fix this. Speaking of fixes, we've got more. Yay! All right, this is a big one because it is a software SDK again that is from a company that is used in lots of DVRs, cameras, baby monitors that could let an attacker access the video and audio streams. And it is part of a software development kit that is that's inside more than 83 million devices. This SDK is called Koitech Kale, and it basically lets people connect smart devices with their mobile apps. This vulnerability reminds me of Ripple 20, which came out last year and was a TCP/IP vulnerability that was part of an underlying software development kit from a vendor. And again, the weakness in the SDK meant it got promulgated to lots of devices. And, what are you going to do in this situation? The only option is to patch.
Just to explain why these SDKs are so important, a lot of vendors either don't have the time or don't want to spend the time and money to create all these ways for devices to communicate their data, share their data. So from a camera perspective, you've already got so many solutions out there that get video feeds to the cloud or to a phone, et cetera. So it's a reusability thing. And in this case, and in many cases actually, but in this case, the Koitech Kale service is basically a plug and play system for hardware makers to add the software to video cameras. That's why it becomes so prevalent and why you'll see 83 million devices, no small amount, because so many companies just make the hardware and leverage what's already available. Makes total sense.
Yes. This one's particularly bad because it basically, if a hacker has access to your device's unique ID, they can get into it and then watch video, and you will have no power to get them out. So this is frustrating. I assume we will see patches.
There actually is some mitigation already, which is good, but it's going to be up to the vendors of these devices to enable two optional features of the SDK, the encrypted DTLS communication protocol and the auth key API authentication mechanism. That's part of their SDK.
Woof. All right. And then finally, one more vulnerability. This one in the QNX software from BlackBerry, which means what, Kevin?
Which means lots of cars as well as medical devices that use QNX, which is BlackBerry's. Well, they were using it for phones and tablets, but it's been in cars for a long time and has expanded beyond that to, again, medical devices and other things. This one is a vulnerability in the memory allocation functions of the C runtime library, C, that's been around since 1972. It's in the QNX software development platform for medical devices, for safety and vehicles. Basically, this is a way for an exploit to happen because if somebody has access to the device, network access to the device running QNX, they can make a C call to allocate and initialize a block of memory, but they can actually allocate and request more than is available, creating a buffer overflow, and then they have all kinds of fun other things they can do once they have that.
We should have a show today in buffer overflow exploits and telnet exploits. All right.
They do have downloads available for what that's worth. But I'm going to say this, shame on you, BlackBerry, because apparently Politico is reporting that BlackBerry resisted announcing the major flaw in its cars and hospital equipment software until the U.S. government stepped in. In fact, there was even some slides internal to BlackBerry saying, nobody's going to know about this if we don't tell them, essentially. And, well, that got found out.
That is the old and wrong way to think of that. Boo, BlackBerry.
Shame.
Okay. Moving beyond security news, let's talk about the Industrial Internet Consortium. Today, it is announced that it is going to become the Industry Iot Consortium. So from the IIC to the new IIC. And the reason they're doing this is they're basically saying that, you know what, we're going to focus on digital transformation. We're not just going to focus on I guess, industrial internet stuff. So this is them basically saying, hey, it's not enough to have the tech specs for the digital transformation. They're finally recognizing that digital transformation is really about process. So you can change all the technology, but if you don't address the processes that people have to do on top of that technology, you're never going to succeed. So this is going to basically focus on tech and how to make that tech work. I really like the IIC, I'll be honest.
Yeah, no, it's a needed change, or at least it's a needed piece of the market that I think is missing. It's wonderful that we talk about all these technologies and what they can do and everything else. But if you don't have a framework and a process around how to design and implement and support, then they're just things.
Yeah. And I love reading their reports. I encourage everyone to check them out. Just because they do test beds for particular use cases, they also do wide-ranging reports on things like trust and security and business models. It's a very good organization.
And I love that you love reading their reports.
Yes, I know, Kevin. I would never make you read that. Okay. Hey, Kevin, news that you're going to like because it relates to the smart home and operating systems.
Ooh, what is it?
Google's Fuchsia OS is now rolling out to every first-gen Nest Hub. I have it on mine, and I'm going to say I didn't notice it at all.
Well, you shouldn't, because it's really just a behind-the-scenes kind of change, but that's good to know. I know a couple weeks back it was starting to roll out to some hubs, but I think the first-gen hubs were either out of luck or it was a very limited rollout. At this point, it is now a widespread rollout. So I don't know that you can manually update this, and you may not even care if you have a first-gen hub. I do have one. And the reason I say you may not care is because what's happening here is the microkernel that basically runs the operating system and handles everything on up from the hardware to the application layer. That's changing to Fuchsia. That's the Fuchsia OS that Google has been working on for several years. So you won't see many, if any, major UI changes. I think they are replacing some of their widgets with Flutter, but most people, again, don't care about that, other than me anyway.
Widgets. All right. Yes. Mine still works, so I'm happy. All right. And a little bit of news from space. Inmarsat, which is a satellite company, I'm pretty sure most of y'all have heard of it. They're going to launch a narrowband network for IoT connectivity, and it's going to be called ELERA. ELERA. They're going to do it in trial modes with airline customers next year. This is going to be able to deliver up to 1.7 megabits down, and the modules that will receive the signal are going to be smaller and cheaper. So this is part of, these are not going to compete with something like Swarm, because Swarm is way cheaper than anything you're going to buy from Inmarsat at $60 for their receiver and then $5 a month for their connectivity, but it's also 2.5 times faster, so more bandwidth. And they're going to launch some more satellites to support this. Basically, I'm just letting y'all know in case you're in the market for satellite IoT and you need more than some of the smaller bandwidth options out there. So maybe you want to send like a picture along with your sensor data. This might be the option. This is still not going to get you video or anything crazy, but more the merrier, right? Sure.
You want to see the mouse you just caught in that connected mousetrap.
No, you never want to see that. Okay.
That's a good point.
I'm like, no, I don't need dead mice on the internet. Okay. Well, that concludes the news portion of the show, but let us talk about the Iot Podcast Hotline. Y'all, I know it's the dog days of summer, but I want y'all to call us at 512-623-7424 and ask us your questions. Also, I want to tell you that the hotline is sponsored this week by Silicon Labs Works With event. This is their IoT event. It takes place September 14th through 15th. It is virtual. And y'all, I'm really excited about this. This is an event that is going to have the smart home stuff that we're used to, but it also has an industrial, a smart cities component. I'm actually hosting a panel on bringing medicine into the IoT. So there's going to be lots of market discussions, workshops, talk about trends, and you're really going to want to be there. So you can register for free at workswith.scilabs.com. Okay. And this week on the hotline, we have a voicemail from Brian, who has what I think is going to be a problem for more and more people going forward. Let's hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Stacey and Kevin. This is Brian in Denver. I'm looking at my house, and I want to have an EV charger and a heat pump for air conditioning and heating. And I do not have enough current at my circuit breaker panel to do both. And I know you've had Span on the show a couple times, and I thought they might be able to handle this kind of thing, so they don't let the EV charger charge while the heat pump's on. But everything I find on their website is related to battery backup. Does Span manage load control without a battery? Thank you. Bye.
Oh, Brian, I'm so glad you heard about Span. And I'm glad that we introduced this to you because I really think what they're offering is so cool. It is very expensive, but you don't have to have the battery with it. I think they market that so heavily because upgrading your electrical panel is kind of expensive. And if you're doing it along with like a solar panel installation or a big backup battery installation, you just kind of fold all that in, you get financing for it, and you don't think about it.
Yeah, the battery is an add-on option.
Yes. So you don't have to have the battery. And if you want to do this, and this is, I think, a lot of homes have like 200 amps coming in, and that may not be enough for everyone now. Or maybe you're on an older system and you only have 160 or 150. These are real issues that people are going to run into.
There are electric vehicles that, even for what I would now consider slow fast charging, if that makes sense, use 50 amps. And
that is a lot.
Yes, it is a lot. And I mean, I'm running into that myself with the Leaf that I have. Luckily, I just deal with a slower charge and I'm not blowing fuses. So
yeah. Wow. You can also, I know that my car charges at 40 amps and you can go into the software settings and lower that to 20 amps, which is what I do when I travel to my dad's house. He's a self-taught electrician. We'll just call it that. It's DIY guy. And he actually jerry-rigged a way for me to charge that. But if I pull the full 40 amps, it blows circuits. So
blows up the house.
It doesn't blow up the house. My dad's not a terrible electrician. He's just self-taught. Anyway, Brian, you can get a Span. I will say that some of our people have found Span to be less than responsive. They are a startup. They are dealing with a lot of balls in the air. So I wish you luck in getting a hold of them. I want to put that one caveat in there because for a while they weren't trying to market outside of the US and some of our non-US people were really excited about it. So let us know your experience. I would love to hear it. Okay. And remember, if you would like us to answer your question, give us a call at 512-623-7424. I didn't tell you what you were going to win. I don't know. Let's call it a smart speaker this time. Smart speaker of your choice if we select you. And right now, you have a really good chance of winning. So call us. And that concludes this portion of the show. But please stay tuned for our guest, Vanya Samuelson, who is the CEO of Koitech. She is going to be talking about bringing power management assessments as part of the product build cycle. And it's a really fascinating way to think about low power and low power consuming devices. So stay tuned for that. And now a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Very. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick break from the Internet of Things podcast for a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Very, a leading IoT engineering firm, and I have Bill Flaherty here, who is the hardware practice lead at Very, ready to talk to us. All right, Bill, so I understand that your team has a fairly unique approach to hardware development. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right, Stacey. Most hardware development practices are decades old, and while software development practices have evolved, hardware is mostly stuck in the 20th or even 19th centuries. Instead of accepting the status quo, we've got a new way of doing things, Agile hardware development.
All right, Agile hardware development. That sounds interesting, but what does that actually mean?
Well, just like for software, Agile hardware focuses on encouraging tight team collaboration, constant interaction with the customer, and being receptive to change, rather than tied to a requirements document. We focus on designing and prototyping small bites of work instead of trying to engineer the whole system all at once. That allows us to iterate quickly, identify issues sooner, and get to market faster.
Excellent. So Very is a 100% remote company. How does that work with hardware development?
We have advanced hardware labs in each engineer's home. That means we can build a prototype for clients quickly and efficiently. We can build, break, and repair hardware on a very rapid cadence.
Oh, so you're breaking hardware on purpose?
Yes. When a large hardware prototype fails after years of development, it can be both financially and emotionally devastating for the team. The difference with Agile is that we're building and breaking hardware early and often. Then we use that feedback to improve the design while the product is still in development. That may sound pricey, but over the long run, it'll save the organization money. It's kind of like the difference between a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage and a balloon mortgage. If you invest in breaking hardware prototypes early and often, you won't have that huge bill come due at the end of the project.
Nice. All right, Bill. Where do I go to learn more about how Very can help me with my IoT project?
You can reach out to us at verypossible.com/Stacy. That's VERY possible.com/STACEY.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and today's guest is Vanya Samuelson, who is the CEO of Koitech. And we've got a little theme running this week, or rather this week and last week. We're trying to talk about saving energy in computing broadly and IoT systems in particular. Vanya, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Koitech does, and people will figure out why you're here talking to us.
Thank you, Stacey. Well, at Koitech, we strive to create the most efficient developer tools for energy optimization. It's something that we really are passionate about, and we believe that these tools can be very comprehensive, yet they should be easy to use, and they should be easy to use throughout the whole stack. So the energy optimization is not just a thing for one very hardcore hardware developer in the lab, but it is actually something that everybody up to the software, including software, should be using. We're a Swedish company. We have our heritage in doing a lot of smart devices and a lot of energy optimization in companies like Sony and Ericsson.
Can you walk me through a process of using any kind of power analysis in product development? And how am I going to use something like this to help reduce energy?
Great question. And I think this is a very important one that people throughout product development should be asking themselves, especially prior to that. I think most commonly people would assume that the energy optimization, or actually rather the battery life, is something that you kind of agree on in the beginning based on some assumptions, and then you fix it later, unfortunately, with some firefighting and delays in the project. What you would want to do is that absolutely in the beginning of the product development, introduce ways of measuring continuously throughout the project, getting different types of insights on the energy optimization. Every time you change a hardware or you have a firmware updates or anything like that, there should be an iterative process of measuring and checking how has that changed and how does it have an impact on the actual battery life that you kind of estimated to begin with. It should not only be a thing, again, that hardware developers would use, but firmware developers need to be introduced to this, and also getting kind of later in the project where you're doing field measurements, you're talking about kind of ecosystem measurements. This is something that you should be able to iteratively get insights about and finalize for your production and for your release on the market. And I think working in a lot of projects throughout the years, product development ones for the different types of devices, not only IoT, it's unfortunate to say that energy optimization gets a little bit of left behind. You start thinking about it, and then there's so much that happens, and then you start thinking about it again when it's a little bit too late. We need to get this prioritization very early on and followed up not only by engineers, but the product owners, project leaders, and iteratively followed up on.
Okay, so it becomes part of the entire design process is like energy usage. And I think this is a really it's a new way of thinking because honestly, when I'm thinking about IoT devices, I focus on the energy consumption of the chip, right? So there are plenty of companies out there building new silicon that uses energy harvesting or spends a lot of time in sleep mode. But it sounds like there are other areas that we could be optimizing for energy reduction. And so I would love to hear if I bring this in early in the process, let's say I'm starting with an energy efficient chip, where else can I see gains? Is it gains in energy reduction? I don't know how to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, we are lucky to live in a time where people are really focused on this. And like you say, there are a lot of low power components that you can pick from, and there are low power technologies to pick from. I usually recommend to start from a kind of high level, saying, first of all, you need to know your application and your device. You need to really be spot on. What do you want to do with your device? You need to understand your normal user case, and then you have to understand what are the kind of corner cases for that device, which means either it's, say, a temperature thing, or it's a mobility thing, or it can be anything really. But if you know your application, then you know then what kind of environment it's going to be and how often it's going to be sending, what kind of data it's going to be sending, then you can choose the right technology for it. And you can choose the right technology that will be then low power technology for that specific user case. And on top of that, then you will start choosing the right low power components. Next big thing would be then integration. And this is where we're talking then about really great engineering, right? Where you, now that you have your device, you have, well, your application chosen, your technology chosen, you have to really engineer it in a way to go to sleep. And that's extremely important. And it might not happen just because you have chosen different types of components that are low power. They're not automatically going to be low power when you integrate them. When you are, let's simply say you choose a really great hardware and then you put layers and layers of software on top of it that are not really optimized. I mean, you are definitely then ruining the performance of the hardware actually. So you are your whole integration and your whole system end up draining a lot of battery. So you need to kind of go into understanding that when I put these things together on the subsystem level, understand what is draining the battery, what is taking the power, and optimize for that.
Got it. And that ties in with a lot of people have been focusing on writing software that is more energy efficient as well. And just to get people maybe excited about this, with customers who are using your product to track this sort of thing, what are the results? Like, how much energy are they able to save, or how much energy could a developer be expected to save?
I think if I give you a couple of examples, or at least one example, we have had customers coming quite close to the release of their sensor and really excited about putting it in the market, and they have chosen a coin cell to work with us. I think they were, a month just before releasing it, and they came in contact with us, and we started measuring and seeing like how is the performance, and we realized very quickly that the sensor really stopped working after like 2 seconds up. We couldn't even boot. What happened then is that very simply they didn't really estimate correctly what type of battery would work with their energy consumption profile. So whatever their application and device was doing, it was not matching how the battery can handle that profile. So what happened is obviously that they had to delay the release by about 3 months, new hardware spin, and I think anybody listening that is involved with these type of things will understand how much that actually costs, delaying 3 months and doing a new hardware spin just prior to releasing. So a lot of those kind of examples. We have had companies monitoring different type of water monitoring and digging down the sensors underground and having to dig them out again after 4 months, and where they plan to have them under there for 2 years, just because they really never properly profiled the application and chose the right source, the energy source for it, or didn't shut down the things that they were supposed to shut down, or they chose something that wasn't really appropriate for that specific temperature, let's say. I think those are the examples that we see quite often, and the percentage of time that you can save or the percentage of money that you can save is quite obvious for anybody who works in any type of product development. But then again, it's very specific for each of the companies. If you're a startup, you might save definitely. I mean, you might actually go down because you have to do a new hardware spin, and that is very extremely costly. Whereas a bigger company perhaps can take it, but then again, it's a fight with the competitors, anything like that. So it means different from different people, different companies, but it's costly if you don't do what we are offering you to do.
And how typical is it that you think companies add this whole new process to their design process?
I think it's changing a lot. I think 3 years ago when we started, people were still thinking in the really kind of traditional ways. What do you mean? There is a oscilloscope here in the lab, or there is this thing here. And then something really happened, I think, when the IoT space started to actually go on market in a way, like when you start seeing actually things on the market and we're starting to deliver things to the customers, then you realize very early that, hey, we are getting paid for a service that is on top of this hardware that we are just kind of thinking is a hygiene. It just needs to be there. But it's actually the hardware that is ruining the whole business case. We're losing money because we delivered something and now we have to either change batteries all the time or we have to take it down. So that kind of service then is suddenly ruined. And what we've seen then that it became a pain, like a proper pain. And with that, people start introducing in their software development. So, for example, we see our product and this kind of mindset very much in the continuous integration with software development, where previously you would see only maybe speed and memory and these kind of things being very much focused on. And because of that, now you see actually energy becoming one of the parameters where people would measure prior to submitting a line of code and making sure that doesn't ruin everything that they have built or that branch of software that they have or are going to be releasing is not affected by the changes that they do, either in the product development, but also in the maintenance when the product is actually out there. You can end up in changing something and that will have actually an impact on how the battery is going to be drained. And you might end up shutting down something that is being in the hands of the customer at that particular moment.
Yikes. Okay, let's take it bigger. Let's go to I know we've talked about the product as its own system with chips and components and integration and even the application running on it. Let's take it bigger because IoT devices are usually part of a system. So how, if I'm designing my products to work, like sensors to work with gateway devices or other things, how should I be thinking about energy use in the system as a whole? What are some best practices there?
I think it goes back to what I mentioned before, that you really need to know your device or your application, what do you want to use it for, and then pick the right technology. Because in some of these different technologies, you would have different power modes that you can utilize really well, whereas in some others you can't, depending on what you really want to be doing. You can then very easily set different settings. So I would say, for example, within LoRaWAN, if you have a so-called Class A device, you would have the option to put different parameters like spreading factor, which will then affect how often you are sending or how long you are on air. And the longer you're on air, the more you spend, but then it's a compromise with coverage and these kind of things. So I think it's extremely important to understand these technologies that you're picking and what kind of options within this system you have to optimize that will benefit the actual device. And I mean, we see that more and more that these big stakeholders within telecom operators, like we have Deutsche Telekom that we have been working with, that are really keen on helping everybody coming in their network with IoT devices to really think about this properly, because you don't want to be ruining it for everybody else, right? You want to have optimized capacity, you want to have optimized network, and battery is definitely going to impact that. For them, it's very important to verify that everything that is actually coming into this network is done in a proper way and people have been thinking of a better life, which I think it's really good because it's really changing this narrative about battery and kind of putting almost like a quality stamp. Like today, we have the access to technology and to buying actually a lot of hardware off the shelf. So you need to be really smart about it, because if you just buy something and put a lot of layers of software on top of it, and you might ruin some for somebody else or even for your own business case. And the stakeholders are not allowing that to happen because they're trying to find a quality aspect of it. And hopefully that is going to be a good initiative for everybody to think that, yeah, okay, I have to think more about how I am performing in this specific system.
And we've talked about this, obviously, with regards to battery-powered devices, because those, the pain point is so high there. But there are tons of devices that are plugged in and might be made more efficient. Do you see interest in product developers using this kind of analysis for devices that aren't battery-powered, that are wired?
It's something that we will probably experience down the line in a sense, because it is a shift, right? And I mean, what IoT developers didn't do before, maybe 3 years ago, is because they really didn't have maybe enough of these devices out there and they didn't understand the pain point. But the movement today with energy optimization, or I would say the sustainability aspect of not only the environmental one, but also business one, will eventually also move to, say, devices or products that are plugged in. I think then we will see also more of the end users being much more educated and much more interested in actually demanding certain level of performance. I mean, today we accept certain behavior from our phones. Because we can charge them, right? Or our wristwatch, or our TV, or our computer. But I mean, at certain point, it will be something that we will think and say, hey, this wristwatch, I don't have to actually charge it every other day. I actually can do it only once a week, or maybe every 2 weeks. And that is actually very important for me as a person, from my practical perspective. But I have this requirement about actually not polluting the world anymore. Or I can make this small effort in picking something that is much more energy optimized. But it's a mind shift, and it takes a very long time, I would say. And a lot of things, new technology needs to mature, and then it needs to kind of hit the point where people are not just looking to be practical and entertained, but also there is a little bit of higher vision about that, like then battery life. And I think that will change.
I hope you're right. I
it's
definitely...
too early now, definitely.
Okay. All right. Well, Vanya, thank you so much for coming on the show this week. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It was fun, and I hope there's a lot of listeners out there that are agreeing that we do need to work on this energy optimization from different aspects, and definitely IoT will be leading the way.
And that concludes this week's episode of the Internet of Things podcast. Please join us next Thursday, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you can't get enough IoT news, I would love for you to sign up at www.stacyoniot.com for our weekly IoT newsletter, where we explain all kinds of things that we don't even get to on the show. Once again, thank you for listening, and please subscribe.